Right, good afternoon and welcome to another Friday lunchtime seminar. Today we have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Virginia Webb, who's recently completed her PhD at Massey University in anthropology, looking at school cooking and gardening programs as well as community gardens. Virginia has been involved for many years in food issues as a researcher, a policy advisor, and as an entrepreneur. So very interested to hear what you've got to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. Thank you, and welcome, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about my research, which is not long finished. As Caroline said, it was in anthropology, so it was a kind of hands-on, long-term ethnographic field research rather than anything statistical. So it's quite qualitative. It's extremely qualitative. So my research began with an interest in alternative food networks and involved fieldwork in community gardens around Palmerston North. And I started my research imagining that gardeners were actively cultivating a more environmentally sustainable and socially just way of producing and distributing food, critiquing a globalised, homogenised and hegemonic food system. But I actually found something really different. I found that the practice of gardening was a way for garden organisers to preserve a sort of national and cultural identity, which they perceived as being at risk of degradation and loss. For the gardeners, gardening, and particularly the cultivation of food crops, signifies attitudes and practices of self-reliance, domestic competence, and a connection with nature and the community. So I'll briefly describe the different gardens that I participated in, and I'll briefly also outline the national identity that I think underpins our love of gardening, particularly vegetable gardening, and our belief in its sustaining value, including some historical context as to why that is. I'll also outline the implications of this approach to gardening for the garden organisers and the objects of their gardening efforts. This includes a blindness to the sort of different circumstances in which people's food and eating practices and discourses develop. And because this was a PhD project, I'll include some sort of theoretical framework that I assembled to make sense of my research. So, initiatives such as community gardens and free food stores are enjoying a bit of a resurgence of interest in New Zealand at the moment, and other developed economies as well, and their strategies to address concerns about issues like food security, poverty, poor diets. There are also sites for community development, often social engagement is an issue, and in many areas there are a way to remedy urban blight and political disengagement. And garden advocates have even promoted them as a way of building community resilience, especially in New Zealand in the wake of the Kaikoura and Christchurch earthquakes. In Queensland as well, they had a big resurgence in community gardening after all the floods a few years ago. And with such a wide range of potential benefits, I wondered what gardeners hoped to achieve when they first turned the soil in a community garden. So the research question that I explored in my project was, what is it people think they do when they do community gardening? And I looked particularly at instigators or organisers of community gardens, the volunteers who secure land, funding and other resources to get projects underway, and who they reach out to other gardeners to join them. So rather than the sort of what people have described as object gardeners, the objects of this gardening efforts, I've looked at the organisers. And I found that community gardeners referred to a range of potential benefits in explaining their involvement with gardening projects. Overwhelmingly, however, they focused on the food grown in community gardens rather than the environmental green space attributes and the personal attributes of gardeners. Organisers sought to pass on knowledge about where food comes from, how to grow it, and what to do with it once gardeners have kind of coaxed it from the ground. And they framed these skills as essential to a healthy, wholesome life. So I joined 4 community gardens in Palmerston North, four to a dozen really. So the first one, the Eastern Community Garden, was run by a church-based community trust, and it attracted particularly migrants and refugees, Palmerston North Refugee Resettlement Program. I then joined the Southwest Community Garden, and this was actually 2 gardens in one space. It was partly run by the Green Hub, which is a community environmental organisation, and partly by the Department of Community Corrections to put people serving community sentences. And these two organisations started the garden in partnership, but as you can see from that third slide along the top, their partnership eventually broke down, a giant gate went up and it became Community Corrections Garden. And while for the period I was volunteering in it, it was essentially two gardens operating in exactly the same space. It was a very Doctor Who sort of thing. And the final one was Plant to Plate Aotearoa, which is a local Manawatu equivalent of the sort of cooking to garden to table program, the Stephanie Alexander Kitchen program, which you might be familiar with here in Wellington. This was across several schools, and I conceived of it as a discontiguous community garden because the organisers were always trying to involve wider members of the community from outside of the school gates to try and keep the garden going. So that was it. I spent about 2.5 years volunteering and gardening, sometimes running my own plot and sometimes working with others. So the contribution of domestic gardening and home food production to New Zealand's national identity, I found was really hard to overstate. Home gardens have been a really accepted and expected feature of New Zealand's domestic environment since the earliest days of colonial settlement. I mean, gardening was necessary for sheer survival when retail food options were limited. And in the days before refrigerators and 7 days a week shopping, domestic vegetable garden remained the most reliable source of fresh produce for the table. So New Zealand urbanised rapidly in the 60s and 70s, but domestic vegetable cultivation remained something of a necessity for much of New Zealand's population until quite recently, because the pace of development meant that suburbs kind of expanded in advance of facilities and services such as shops and public transport. And of course, the 7-day-a-week shopping thing only happened, I think, in the late 70s and early 80s, so it's quite a modern phenomenon. And many urban areas, of course, still lack access to reliable supplies of fresh produce or transport options to get to a supermarket. These are the food deserts that we often talk about. And this makes the continuation of New Zealand's gardening tradition appear really salient. But apart from providing food for the table, early domestic gardens also contributed to the general economic well-being of households. So in early New Zealand, it gave workers a degree of material independence. Fairburn, Otago researcher, I think, suggests that gardens operate as a surrogate welfare state by providing a source of food when paid work was scarce. And he characterised waged earners who held land, and that was much more common, as hybrid peasant workers, neither fully integrated into the labour market and nor independent producers. And the idea that workers may not be fully integrated into the labour market holds a lot of contemporary resonance, of course. And the emergence of short-term, non-standard and insecure employment in the developing gig economy means that many see vegetable gardens as potentially fulfilling the same welfare function in current times of precarious employment and a curtailed welfare state, despite significant changes in labour and housing markets. The housing market issue is important. So one of the reasons why domestic gardening has been so central to New Zealand's national identity is that New Zealand, relative to other developed countries, has had unusually high rates of home ownership and thus secure tenure. And even though urban sections have been shrinking and an urban quarter acre is a pretty rare find these days, most dwellings still have space for some gardens and other outdoor living environments. So gardening, both for production and leisure, continues to be part of many of our way of life. It's a very familiar part of our lives. Now, it's telling that one of the clearest descriptions of the New Zealand national character that I found, in terms of the one delineated by the garden organisers, came from the Minister of Housing in 1957. And this quote comes from a booklet titled Home Ownership and How to Achieve It. And it asserts that New Zealanders are firm believers in the worth and value of home ownership, provides a secure basis for the welfare and happiness of the family, develops initiative, self-reliance, thrift, and other good qualities which go to make up the moral strength of the individual, of the family, and of the nation. And I found that this conception of housing was still incredibly salient and strong. But like gardening, home ownership is a really defining feature of New Zealand's identity, but people's increasing inability to climb the housing ladder, once seen as the sure path to economic stability, is a source of policy anxiety. New Zealand still has a high proportion in a global context of people living in homes that they own, but this proportion is shrinking. Sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. But this proportion is shrinking, and declining rates of home ownership have shaped political discourse over the past decade. Oh, I sound booming now. Household wealth correlates really strongly with home ownership, with ethnicity and with age, which means that homeowners are increasingly older, more likely to be Pākehā, have fewer children living with them than the total population. And homeowners are also likely to be wealthier because these shifting dwelling patterns reflect growing housing-mediated inequality. Falling rates of home ownership form the backdrop to the recent rise of community gardens, and they're still often promoted as a solution to food insecurity, ascribed to problems of access to land for gardens, lack of permission to cultivate land in rented accommodation, and a lack of provision for allotments or other sort of growing spaces in urban development plans. So garden organisers mentioned all of these issues when asked why they promoted gardening projects. But I found that garden organisers' enthusiasm coalesced around two main narratives. So the first one is that gardening is an essential skill, like cooking, budgeting, and other domestic competencies that they perceive as being lost. And I've described this as the lost generation narrative. And this narrative holds that people on the margins of society, such as offenders or children and their parents, lack the skills and the knowledge to correctly feed themselves or instruct their children in appropriate choices as regards food and health. They may also be unable to manage their domestic affairs appropriately, and this was common in all my research sites. So the quotes on the screen come from volunteers at the school cooking and gardening program. They're also very anxious that kids didn't know what a leek looked like or couldn't name an avocado if it was held up, and that sort of thing. The next slide, this is from the Green Hub, Totara Road Garden. This was another kind of really typical comment that we've lost gardening skills, that they're not being passed down, primarily, generally from mothers or grandmothers. That's very gendered kind of a expectation about who should be doing this work. And then this is from the community corrections garden, talking about people doing, it's not called PD anymore, doing community service. So it's just a general widespread concern. So garden organisers also use these narratives, the lost generation narratives, for recipients of garden produce, and each of the gardens distributed surplus produce through either a free food store or through a food bank. And they extended these kind of lost generation narratives to the recipients of the food. So eating habits and cooking skills attract the most concern when they're thought to be declining, found wanting or inadequate. And so gardening and cooking programs are therefore most likely to emerge as policy responses at times of moral panic about the basic state of human survival skills. And this leads on to the second dominant narrative. And the second narrative goes, if it all falls apart, they'll need to be able to grow their own food. Which is kind of seems a lot more relevant in the COVID days, but at the time I was writing it, it was pre-COVID. So, but this narrative says, if it all falls apart, you'll be able to grow your own food. And it's an anxious narrative that marries concern about the future to fears about a loss of the skills, attitudes, and practices that are believed to have been common in the past. So organisers really struggled to describe the ominous social, economic, technological, environmental, and microbiological sort of threats that they perceived looming on the horizon, but they definitely thought they might lead to a diminished quality of life or degradation of opportunity, might be able to be mitigated by growing vegetables. But the national identity I found that the garden organisers seek to reproduce, this kind of thrifty number 8 wire bending type person, is not necessarily one to which the objects of their gardening efforts would subscribe. This character, based on attributes such as self-reliance and thriftiness that reflect New Zealand's colonial past and geographical isolation, does not really acknowledge the significant social, political, and economic changes of the past few decades, or the identity of Māori. And there's been a real rise in interest in mahinga kai and marae gardens as well, and they're definitely not part of my research. It's definitely more of a Pākehā community garden stream. I'd say in general, it no longer seems as simple to delineate a singular national identity, if ever it was. So in terms of the theoretical stuff, this is just a holding slide because I couldn't find a good slide of Michel Foucault. But to make sense of all the unexpected influence of issues around identity and concern for the future and the enthusiasm to get certain groups of people into gardening, I turned to the work of Michel Foucault and Ghassan Hage. I also encountered some really interesting effects of the gardens and the way that the gardens in the natural world manage the gardeners, but I've left that out for the purposes of brevity. But Gilles Clément was a French garden philosopher. It's really good on that stuff. Anyway, Foucault. So Michel Foucault does a lot of work on governmentality and discipline. And his work makes sense of the appeal of community gardens to organisations interested in areas such as health, education, family well-being, and community development. And Foucault attends to the way that power plays out in the sort of mundane interactions of everyday life, which makes it possible to explore the myriad ways that gardeners are encouraged to govern themselves, regulate their behaviour, and make responsible choices to maximise their life chances without direction from a hierarchical or linear authority. And what constitutes an appropriate choice of action in Foucault's framework is determined by an assemblage of agencies and institutions, such as schools and healthcare providers that have an interest in disciplining or shaping the political subject. So Foucault's work's really ideal for exploring power in community gardens across different settings because they involve relationships with a range of government and non-governmental agencies, charities, churches, other institutions like that. And I often think of public health as a very Foucauldian discipline, or certain aspects of public health as a very Foucauldian discipline. And so Foucault only got me so far, and to understand why some people assume managerial authority in the gardens or take it upon themselves to start digging the gardens and rustle up people to be the gardeners, I turned to the work of Ghassan Hage. His work offers a comparative anthropology of racism, nationalism, and multiculturalism. It's obviously possible to explore these themes in the context of community gardens, but it was actually Hage's concept of managerialism that I used most. And garden organisers possess what Hage calls governmental belonging, which is a managerial role assumed by those who believe that they have the power to have a legitimate view concerning the positioning of others in the nation. So Hage describes dominant governing culture as a sort of fantasy position of cultural dominance born out of the history of European expansion and British colonialism in Australia, where he works, and that's a history that's broadly shared with New Zealand. So one doesn't have to be of British stock in Hage's imagining to hold a sense of governmental belonging, but you must be invested in the idea that the social space should reflect dominant beliefs about how society should look and function, including what we eat, and how we manage our families and domestic affairs. And so to hold a sense of governmental belonging is to perceive oneself as the embodiment of the national will to the extent that it aligns with your own will. So governmental belonging as an organising principle that controls and positions people who do not function appropriately in the social space as objects to be managed and controlled according to the will of the dominant culture. So I've described the sort of migrant gardeners and the children and the other people doing community service as kind of objects to be gardened, and I've said we just have to get them growing their own food. And this was a comment from one of the organisers of the school cooking and gardening program. And it's the we and the them, which is what Hage really brings out with his theoretical approach. Anyone sort of lacking that number 8 Y ability to kind of get on with it are objects to be managed. So organisers describe the gardeners as falling behind, struggling, in need of guidance and direction to make appropriate choices in the realms of food, eating, domestic management, charitable giving, and other sort of perceived deficiencies. But like others, garden organisers imbue discourses around healthy food and family practices with an element of morality. Moralising food practices in this way established a binary of competent organisers on the one hand and deficient, morally lax gardeners on the other. And in the case of school gardens, the school cooking and gardening programs, children are really the channel for accessing their parents. If it's children who aren't bringing proper lunches to school, children become the sort of change agents that these organisations reach through to the parents. So this binary was not really cleanly demarcated in all the gardens. You know, it was sharpest in the Southwest Garden where the offenders worked. Offenders, obviously, having been judged morally lax by the ultimate arbiter of state power, the judiciary. And in the plant to plate garden where the children's parents were more likely to be conceived of lacking, because children are too small to be conceived of as fully formed agents. In the Eastern Community Garden, which is where the migrants and former refugees were, mostly Bhutanese and Nepali and some Tongan gardeners. They were awesome gardeners. And lots of them were Hindu vegetarian as well. So their kind of diet and gardening practices were really beyond reproach. And there, their concern coalesced around their willingness to share and contribute to the collective through the donation of charitable goods to food banks. And they had their own networks of charitable giving, and that was a bit problematic for the garden organisers. So seen from the perspective of moral panic and anxiety about the future, it's not surprising that community gardens have enjoyed a bit of a renaissance and developed economies over the past 2 or 3 decades. So body weights, a visual clue that significant changes are afoot, have risen substantially in affluent countries over this time, especially in English-speaking countries, and this correlates with poor health and social outcomes. And so rising obesity obviously is not a reflection of the spoken language, but of Anglophone countries' experience of rising income inequality, neoliberal competition, uncertainty and stress. And those on the downside of deepening inequality are more likely to have diets dominated by cheap processed foods that are nutritionally compromised. And those on the upside have gained better access to healthful foods like fresh produce, which many are now described as luxury foods in the literature, which is quite shocking. And wealth and income inequality is really being described as having reached a crisis point in New Zealand. And while the links between diet, obesity, health and wealth are complex and contested, garden organisers have proffered school and community gardens as a means of ameliorating the effects of low incomes, poor diets and access to nutritious food. So theorising community gardens as sites of social discipline and managerialism really changed the way that I understood community gardens, but the aspect of research that most shifted my perspective on the potential of community gardens to challenge sort of hegemonic capitalist food systems was cultivating my own plot. While it's possible to see my research sites as sort of conservative outliers in an otherwise radical alternative food movement, my experience of working in the garden revealed the limits of small-scale food production as a way of providing for my family, or shifting the balance of what we ate away from commercially grown or processed foods. And the burden of mundane daily work required to keep everyone in my household fed was not lightened by the addition of gardening tasks at a remote location. So I call this garden materiality, and this is just a list of the kind of issues that I dealt with gardening in a community garden, as opposed to gardening, popping out the back. So we garden at home and I can pop out the back and pick herbs and all that. So, and I'm not in short of food and all, I mean, I wasn't in need of this garden food. So there wasn't any pressing urgency about the success or failure of my community garden. Lots of transport was a big issue. You know, it was 3 kilometers away. I had to cycle, or there were no buses. I couldn't get the car. You know, it was raining. These sort of issues. Agents of resistance. Well, this is my child. He's like, no, I don't want to go to the garden, and I'm not going to eat what's there anyway. And that was a really innovating battle to have. You know, you can imagine you're experiencing food insecurity, and you've got these hungry kids, and you've got to marshal them, pack them all off to the community garden to pick some food. Well, there you go. Planning meals, peeling, scrubbing. It's really, it's always done retrospectively. You don't plan a meal and then pop out of the supermarket to buy what you need. You go to the garden to see what's there and what the bugs haven't eaten, and you bring it home and you work around that. And in the end, all we were eating was silver beet, which was a level of dietary monotony that none of us could really take. And we had a lot of anxiety about waste. You know, food waste is a big narrative at the moment. So constantly preserving, and I learned how to bottle artichokes, freeze, steam things. It was a constant source of anxiety and a real indication of the way that we conceive of food waste. I mean, gardens are so abundant often that you have to change the way you think about it as compost in the ground, really, or something for the bugs to eat. The supply was incredibly unreliable. There was a lot of theft from the garden, and all of the gardens experienced this, and people would often report taking things before they were ripe just to make sure no one else got them, and that sort of thing, and the communal beds. And the seasonal monotony in the hungry months, winter's pretty tedious. There's not that much growing, and there's long periods. So all of these kinds of things that in my experience of gardening really shifted my thinking on the actual practical reality of using community gardens as a way of addressing people's food needs. So the other issue, of course, is that this is largely women's work, right? My experience highlighted the sort of unacknowledged gender implications of entreaties to grow your own food. And women still overwhelmingly take responsibility for food provisioning in New Zealand households. Something like 94% of food work in households with children is done by women. 2013, I can find you the reference. Otago School of something. Anyway, Otago, down in Dunedin, it was research done. Obviously very reputable. And acknowledging the gendered aspects of food work is really important when considering the framing of home and community gardens as a solution to food insecurity, poor food choices, and related health outcomes. So not only are women most likely to take responsibility for food work in their homes, women and households with children are also overrepresented in poverty statistics and most likely to experience insecure housing. The costs involved in establishing a garden, the long time horizons, the unpredictability and perishability of garden produce, the risk of theft, and the problems of accessibility and transport make gardening a uniquely unsuitable solution to food insecurity, I found, arising from poverty or a lack of access to domestic garden space. Maybe if you've got a garden out the back of your house and secure tenure, you'll get a reasonable amount of food out of it, but generally uniquely unsuitable response to food insecurity. I put that in bold. So the gender implications of gardening as a solution to food insecurity weren't always so clearly demarcated, I think, and people's fondness for gardens involves elements of nostalgia. So all of the garden organisers' childhood memories of domestic food production involved a dad who dug the garden and a mum who cooked the food. They all recalled a time when work was plentiful and a single wage was enough to support a family. There was nothing to do at the weekends, shopping was a mundane chore rather than a leisure activity. And above all, they recalled a time when ontological security, the resources needed to materially and socially reproduce their standard of living, was widely held. And this is certainly no longer the case. Many people in New Zealand are now ontologically insecure. So garden organisers who experience more ontological security than the gardeners feel a bit of anxiety and worry because the social order that supports their security now appears fragile. The deprivation and marginalisation experienced by the insecure threatens to manifest as everything falls apart. But I'd like to finish by saying, it's not all gloom. It's not all gloom in the gardens. There's lots to love about community gardens, and they can be really radical in their critique of global food systems. Firstly, gardens make visible the full cycle of fresh fruit and vegetable production from planting to harvest, with seasonal cycles and the work that takes place on the perimeter, the composting, weeding, fallowing and rotations being revealed over months and years. There's no small matter given that the origins of much of our food are hidden these days beyond remote global trading relationships, industrial processes, regulatory interventions, and concentrated distribution networks. And community gardens added another level of immediacy to the revival of local food networks such as farmers markets, community-supported agriculture, organic box delivery schemes. But unlike these alternative sites of transaction, community gardens are located at the nexus of public, private, and community life and confront prevailing expectations and assumptions about the availability and form of food. As sites of food production, community gardens' unreliability and uneven rates of production foster a kind of critical understanding of the complexities of producing food on a sustainable basis and what's involved in making it so aesthetically pleasing. So as public spaces, gardens offer the opportunities to engage with garden produce in a sensory way. People use their senses to evaluate the ripeness of produce or the damage wrought by insects and molds. And the usual mediators between plant and mouth, like labels, use-by dates, processing, cooking, assembling, are all missing in the garden. So gardeners enter a sort of visceral realm that's really unfamiliar to many of them. Garden organisers at each of my sites referred to gardeners' inability to recognise and name fruit and vegetables. So gardening is thus a way of knowing food that sits outside the dynamics of food safety regulation and expectations of aesthetic perfection. Gardening involves cultivating embodied discernment of food via the senses, the sort of common sense skills often problematized as declining and leading to unnecessary food waste. Gardens resist that sort of prevalent, gardens reveal, I've messed this up, mainstream, anyway, I'm going to skip this whole sentence because I've messed it up. But the tendency to produce, garden produce, to ripen, bruise and rot, and I've described this as its material agency, amounts to a corrupting trajectory that renders food as waste, kind of underwrites the value of food whose aesthetic qualities maintain values in the market. Food grown in community gardens has no commercial value, and its material agency just sends it on this alternative trajectory, like lost potential, last chance, compost, change the ways that you think about food. And it also shifts decisions about what is good and not good to eat back onto gardeners, cooks and neighbours, and away from supermarkets and TV chefs. So community gardens, in making visible the processes of food production, also render the politics of representation and knowledge production visible. So thank you, that was my condensed research.
Yeah, congratulations on condensing your PhD into 30 minutes. That's very impressive. Do we have any questions? My beautiful assistant.
Thank you for that. Just two questions. You didn't touch on who provides the land. I'm presuming it's the local authorities, and if so, on what terms? And the second thing I wasn't clear on is the organisation for this. The community gets together, but you need a committee, no doubt, or someone to head this. So what is the structure for doing that?
So each of the gardens had a different land arrangement. The school gardens obviously are on school grounds, so I think each school is an independent entity at the moment. And the school gardens often integrated with the curriculum, so schools willingly gave up part of their grounds or already had them from previous school gardening projects or were part of the Enviro Schools projects. The Eastern Community Garden, where the migrants were gardening, was actually land banked. It was held by the Ministry of Justice, and it was had been allocated for a high school. The high school was never built. It was land banked and eventually became part of the Rangatane o Manawatu land treaty settlement, and the garden had to move. So gardens also have insecure tenure, I found. And what was the third one? The Crew that was council land, Crew, the other community garden where yeah. Throughout the country, it's generally land. There's another one in a neighbouring town that's land banked. Occasionally you'll get a private developer who's land banked land for a supermarket or something like that. It's quite a lot of land banking that goes on, and rather than have it go to wasteland, they'll give it to a community group's garden. And in terms of the organisation of each garden, this is really interesting. That's why I focused on the gardeners, because of this demarcation. So the church, it depends who started the garden. The church group that started the garden, Eastern Community Garden, where the migrants and refugees gardened, originally it was a group of family members of the church, and they set up a system where it was all collective decision making, and everyone had to come on a Saturday morning. You could only pick on a Saturday morning, and you had to ask them for a hose. And the whole thing was, was this very collective and yet controlling process. And nothing really happened with the garden for a few years until they appointed a part-time coordinator who kind of organised, they let go of a lot of these kind of controls, and people just came in and gardened, and the garden became a huge success, became an enabling. There was a committee, none of the refugees and migrants were represented on it. It was the garden part-time coordinator and 2 or 3 of the other Pākehā gardeners who belonged to the church, who kind of organised all this stuff. Obviously community corrections, very, they've got a pretty strict hierarchy in there, no mucking about with who's in charge. And the other garden that shared their parallel space was run by community trust really embodied in a single woman who was very active on the community scene for many years around Palmerston North, starting various community groups. And she essentially ran the garden and made decisions about where the food was going to. At one point she decided that we weren't going to give food to Just Zilch anymore, the free food store, because people should pay, the people should give something for the food, and they shouldn't just get it for free. And they wanted to give it to the food bank, because that way at least there was some kind of screening process about who was entitled or deserving of the food. And she also tried to set up a membership scheme where people would pay $15 a month, I think, for access to get food. They're all really, really different, and they very much reflected the personalities. But I didn't come across a single garden where there was not some sort of people who had a very firm sense of governmental belonging and the right to determine, to move others around in the space.
Apologies for being late. Yeah, I think the whole idea of governmental belonging is it really a huge challenge to public health. I mean, at the moment, we've clearly been going through a period of enormous success and achievement in the New Zealand context. But I do think that we do so from a very strong position of governmental belonging, and that also the kind of question of moralising and moral panics about those who are seen to behave in ways that are not accepting of those frameworks and dictates is quite important. Can you link what you're doing at all to what you see happening in our wider community?
Yeah, yes. So, I mean, Gaston Haj's work is mostly expounded in a book called White Nation, and it's really about multiculturalism and the way that we try and retain a particular social order in the face of a obviously changing makeup of the community. And I kind of adapted it to look at the way that we are changing food practices, and I think the idea of how we should be eating and what we should be doing versus the kind of we haven't really adapted these ideas particularly to deal with the changing global food system. I mean, interestingly, that's been a bit interrupted lately, with the COVID. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But there have been really, really dramatic changes in the way that we source our food. I mean, it's quite hard to find fresh flour and produce in the supermarket. You have to fight your way through all of these kind of prepackaged foods. And some people can opt out of having to do a lot of the hard labor of cooking and preparing food now. You buy food bags and people who deliver stuff, and it's kind of pre-chopped and pre-measured and all that. And you get the sort of warm glow of preparing food for your family and serving food at a table and all the rest of it without having to actually do a lot of that work. And so there's this kind of gap between the way that we talk about food, the way that we talk about morality. Morality sounds like such a strong word, but we sort of the uprightness and the appropriateness of good food practices for families, especially children. And you'll see these discourses around what's a good food practice, I mean, everywhere. The Dolmio ads for pasta sauce, always got families sitting under a table, eating together. There's lots of 5 a day, and it's very, very hard to find a discourse that promotes, other than advertising for junk food, obviously, that promotes these alternative ways of doing food and eating food. So I'm getting a bit lost here, but it's it's definitely a gap between ways that we think things should be and the ways that people experience life on the ground, especially for those without the resources to achieve the kind of practices that we think they should be.
I grew up with a large home garden in the Manawatu area.
Yeah.
And I noticed, well, a lot of people no longer have the home gardens, but farmers markets become a big thing. Is this the sort of reaction against the supermarket? Or maybe that's on your postdoc schedule.
And no, farmers markets, and people really like using farmers markets and CSAs, and some of them, a lot of the Manawatu farmers markets are great, and Wellington here as well. You know, they're sort of cheap, they're growers, they bring them. It's a great alternative mechanism, but that doesn't, you know, you can still just buy the stuff. You don't have to do the work of growing your own food. And yes, they might be somewhat less aesthetically pleasing, but they've still been grown professionally and harvested. Yeah. And I think that was a big issue as well, was the level of skill that it takes to actually grow a successful home garden, something that you pick up from your family often and is passed down. This lost generation thing is very real. You know, if you're not picking it up and you're not observing, it can take quite a long time to get the knack for it. And so the idea that people should actually grow their own food from scratch is a different thing again. But, you know, farmers market, there's lots of ways, there's lots of critiques of the commercial global supermarket food system out there, especially in New Zealand, where there's only two main players in the commercial food space, you know. It's got Ubi, yeah.
The farmers market also seems to be quite an important social occasion for them.
Yeah, it really is. It's great. We shop there all the time.
I'll make it quick. Philippa Chapman, I'm really interested in gardens and cities, and I'm on the board of Kaingaora at the moment, and one of the things about density is how much space people need for amenities like gardening, because of course we take the case of Porirua, it was all based on a 1/4 acre section, and the fact that people supplemented their incomes or the benefits by having a big garden. And now, well, of course, there were often, when the bulldozers went through, they just shoved all the topsoil down the gully. So they weren't necessarily good places for growing gardens. And so now there's the sense that with increased density, there's less space for building gardens. And there was quite a lot of discussion about this in the meetings, about how much you should have communal gardens, or each person should have their own space. And I know in the Centennial Park flats, which were done in 1940, which are really beautiful if people haven't seen them, they have made a space for gardens, and they decided not to kind of have a governing group. They put up some place where people could plant things, and they're just waiting to see how it goes. And if people are really interested in it, they're going to kind of help supply things and help support, but it's deliberately not initiated by the landlord.
Oh, that's good. And I did find that having a coordinator, paid coordinator, or someone who organises the compost and the weeding and that sort of thing really helped a lot of the gardens, because it's just managing them is just another burden for a lot of people. But this slide I put back up and these are all dense urban cities without a tradition of home gardening. So Glasgow, where we used to live for a long time, there's New York, Washington, London. These are all places without traditions of home gardening, and they've had various responses. Either small interstitial spaces get turned into gardens. Allotments, of course, in the UK was a real tradition. So different places have different. Yeah, that is tricky. But people do it in different ways, but it's hard to mandate gardening, I think, Thank you.
Do we have one final question, or are we? Yes. Carry on.
Oh no, I didn't. No, but I read. I read a lot about it. Yeah. 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 When the Eastern Community Garden, which was with the migrants and refugees, when it first started, and it was all very, you all have to come on Saturdays and we'll share out the hoses. And they did some early blog posts, and it was all about, we're all going to get together and have communities and learn about each other's cultures and play sport together. And it just didn't really happen. It's just too much of an extra burden on families to give up that particular prescribed time and to come and do these things. Yeah, so no, not really, none of them happened. Yeah, so.
Thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and thank you very much, Virginia, for your interesting talk. And next week we have the cannabis referendum.